3 decades, Harvard graduate and Rhodes Scholar Jonathan Kozol has chronicled the plight of our nation's children. During the late 60s, his first book, Death at an Early Age, helped put urban schools on the political agenda. His current book, Amazing Grace, marks a departure from his previous works. Focusing less on policy, Kozol appeals directly to the conscience of the nation. After 2 years in the South Bronx, in one of the poorest neighborhoods in the United States, Jonathan Kozol gives voice to the children and people whose stories are rarely told. I'm very pleased to have him on this broadcast to introduce us to some of those children and their story and what it is to say about them and their spirit, and at the same time, those odds that seem to be calculated against them. Welcome.
Thank you, Charlie.
What's interesting about this, we can talk about commerce a second and a sense of the American psyche. This book is #1 in Boston, yes, at a time that everybody talks about the conservative mood of the country, number
yes.
one. I mean, this is a cry by you to say to the nation that from where we are here, in one of the richest places in America, 59th Street and Park Avenue, you can take a subway from here and you can take a 20-minute ride up to Mont Haven, you know, and you're in one of the poorest congressional districts, or one of the poorest districts in America, in the South Bronx.
I forgot. That's right. This is exactly where my journey started, right at this corner, 59th Street on the Lexington Avenue train.
One block from here. Exactly one block. And you're saying, what are you saying about that place and those children that somehow, certainly in Boston, it's going to be on the New York Times bestseller list, in the time that we're in, is resonating? What do you think it is?
Well, I think the main reason the book is a bestseller is that it's not a policy book like some that you and I have discussed over the years that I've written.
Like Savage and Equities.
That's right. It's a narrative of a life of one particular woman and about a dozen children over the course of the 2 years that I was in the South Bronx. And it's largely in the words of these children. Now, I mean, there are two things to emphasize. It's a very sad story, and I cried a lot while I was writing it. A lot of people tell me they cry when they read it.
And you even say when you went up there today, your heart is heavy when you're there.
It is, and I'm sure you can hear it in my voice. I try to get up for a television program, but I feel down because I was there again today, and I walked by a building in which I had visited last New Year's Eve, and I remember right after I left, a young kid was murdered in the building I left, and that's just one of 24 deaths that took place in about 6 square block area. So, I mean, the sadness can't be avoided. It's one of the saddest places I've ever been. It's the poorest congressional district in the country. About a quarter of the young women who go to the hospital as babies are HIV positive, so that means an awful lot of children know their mothers are going to die of AIDS. It's got the highest rate of child asthma that I've seen anywhere in the United States, and I got asthma while I was there, partly because of all the toxins in the air. There's a big waste incinerator out there, but I think also just because of the sense of depression, the sense of anxiety, the sense that the children have of being outcast from our society. I mean, all those things are hard to sustain for a grown-up and even harder for a child. And I do tell the sad stories. I mean, I tell the story of Bernardo, the little boy who fell in the elevator shaft of his building. I never knew him. By the time I visited his home, he was already dead, but his grandma told me the story. It's sort of a classic example of a child who died from the neglect of our society. He wasn't shot by a drug dealer. He wasn't, you know, killed in the street. He lived in an apartment building which was in disrepair, like many houses in the neighborhood. It had been abandoned pretty much by New York City when his grandma used to complain that the elevator door was loose and opened without the elevator there. Nobody ever came to fix it. And then one day he was in the corridor and he touched the door. It opened. He fell 5 flights to his death, and his body wasn't found until his blood began to drip on passengers. By the time I visited, he'd been dead for several months, and his grandma and his whole family were in mourning. And they described to me what he was like. And like many of the children that I know who are still alive in the neighborhood, he was very religious. I once asked I'm not Christian, I'm Jewish, and so I'm always asking questions for people to explain to me about their religious faith. And I once asked his aunt if he had, what his religious training was like. And she answered me this way. She said he had done his first communion, but he did not yet know sin. And something about that answer touched me so much that I never even asked her what she meant by that. But I do remember after I left, walking down the stairway, I didn't use the elevator, I was just going down the stairway, and it was so dirty and smelly in that building. I thought of my home where I live up in the country in Massachusetts. I don't have children, but I have a puppy, a golden retriever. And I thought the kennel where I leave my puppy is cleaner than the house in which that little boy lived for the 8 years of his short life. And that just makes me sad. And I don't flash out. You notice in this book, I don't flash out in anger the way I used to do, because sometimes you feel so close to tears that you lack the will to scream, and I don't shout very much.
What you seem to be saying here, and tell me if I'm right, that there are these human beings there, these young, wonderful children.
Real little human beings.
And the nation doesn't know what their life is like.
That's exactly right, Charlie. I think there are two things we don't know. One is I don't think we know just how hard their lives are. I mean, just how tough it is. I mean, the families in the neighborhood were living on one little boy who's the central figure in my book, Anthony. Who'll be watching this program tonight. Anthony's
a writer.
Gifted young writer. He was 12 when I met him. Anthony was living on cold oatmeal the winter that I met him, and his mother hadn't done anything wrong. She wasn't a prostitute or a drug dealer or anything like that. She's a good woman who had to use a lot of her money to keep alive her brother, who was dying of AIDS. And so Anthony and the other children ended up eating cold oatmeal for dinner. And, you know, now when I read that politicians are saying that we've been coddling poor people too much and it's time to get tough, I keep wondering how much tougher could we get with children like that without just killing them. You know, I get terrified at the thought that we're going to get tougher now than we were already.
The critics have raved about your book. Yeah. Now, that's not news to you. You know that. But the only time that someone pauses is to say, I don't know where the solutions are.
Oh, I'm glad you asked that. I'm glad you asked that. This is the first book I've written where I didn't end with a list of suggestions. Right. Do the following 6 things and that'll solve the problem. I used to do that all the time, and then I'd go up to Capitol Hill and I'd testify in front of a Senate committee and I'd list my 6 things, and it would become very mechanical and abstract, and they never were done anyway, but I'd go through the illusion that I was doing something good. Well, I'll go up again. I'll do it again. But if there's a message in this book, it's a much simpler message. It doesn't have to do with programmatic answers, specific answers, because I think Americans know that racial segregation is an obscenity, and I think New Yorkers know that it's wrong to put the most vulnerable children in a neighborhood like this and just leave them there to die. I don't think I need to spell it out. The message of the book, in its simplest terms, was... it was paraphrased by a Baptist preacher I met last week. I was down in Texas on a Baptist radio station. I never thought this Jewish boy would end up on a Baptist station. This was a preacher. I thought he wouldn't like me because he was kind of a redneck type. But something about this book upset him. And someone called up and asked the same question you asked and said, he doesn't say what we should do. And the preacher defended me, and he answered. He said, the answer is in the gospel. When Simon Peter kept asking Jesus, Master, what should we do? You haven't told us exactly what to do. He said, Peter asked Jesus that question 3 times. Finally, Jesus said, if you love me, feed my sheep. I thought that was a very simple and clean answer. If you love me, feed my sheep. Only these aren't even full-grown sheep, Charlie. These are just little lambs.
I now know why you chose the title. Jonathan Kozol, Amazing Grace, The Lives of Children. Take a look at this picture if we can come in. the lives of children and the conscience of a nation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.